Welcome to the Distinguished Physical Education Podcast. This is Gary Zaharatos. My guest today is Jen Smith. Jen is the Physical Education Instructional Curriculum Specialist at Denver Public Schools. She received a Bachelor of Science in Exercise Science and Aquatics at Ball State University and her teaching credential in PE at Metro State University in Denver, along with a Master's in Health and Wellness. She taught for 12 years before moving into the specialist role, where she supports PE teachers throughout the city. I'm really fortunate to get to collaborate with Jen on a regular basis. She is a great thought partner who always pushes my thinking. She also provided me with some much-needed motivation in getting my book over the finish line and has been a huge advocate of this whole Distinguished PE project right from the beginning. For example, starting in September, Jen will be leading a book study with Denver PE teachers who will get PDU credits for engaging in the course. If you enjoyed this episode and are interested in learning more about how the PE teachers in your district can get involved, please email me at gary@distinguishedpe.com. In this episode, we discuss what PE lessons look like when they aren't aligned to a standard. We detail how to create standards-based content and language objectives, along with various ways to communicate them in student-friendly language. We create a CLO based on a social skills standard so that listeners can experience what that process sounds like. We also provide rationale for why teachers should consistently incorporate standards-based content and language objectives, describing the impact they have on the reputation of a PE program and on student learning, along with strategies for how to begin implementing them if this is something new for you. And now I bring you Jen Smith. We've been talking about recording this conversation for quite a while now, so thank you for being willing to share your expertise with our listeners. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Something that you and I have been noticing lately is the omission of standards-based daily objectives from some of the content that we've come across, whether it's at conferences or some things that we see on social media. What we tend to see are lots of fun activities that we know students love engaging in, but we don't always see that really tight connection between the activity and the standards-based learning of the day. So today, you and I are going to describe our philosophy of why standards-based content and language objectives should be the foundation of a high-quality PE program. We're going to talk about how to create them and how to communicate them during the lesson in student-friendly language. But before we get to that, let's describe what lessons look like when they aren't based on standards and when students aren't given opportunities to both demonstrate and articulate their learning.
Yes, like you said, up in conferences, you see activity. And then when I'm going into classrooms, I'm seeing that same thing because they're taking that learning from the conference and just putting it right into place. So they're just simply playing games. They are learning step-by-step rules to it. They're doing exercises. They are being quizzed on the court or field dimensions and learning about the history of the sport. Students may have opportunities to demonstrate something physically, but they're not able to articulate those concepts about the learning, the understanding piece. Students struggle to articulate what they learn in class. So if somebody came and said, "Hey, what are you learning today?" They usually connect it right back to, "We just played this game." And they're not able to say what they're actually learning throughout the class. Teachers face challenges assessing students, oftentimes broadly scanning the gym, visually checking to see if students are performing a skill properly, instead of really getting in there and providing that feedback and letting them progress through that skill.
So one thing that we can do is shout out some of the DPS PE teachers, because I feel like we've made a huge shift over the last several years in particular, where the number of lessons that you and I observe where we see just rules to an activity, or this is how wide a basketball court is, or things like that. We don't really see lessons like that anymore. PE teachers have really started to make that shift and are getting more comfortable with aligning standards-based daily objectives to their activities. Would you agree?
I would. And I think I've been quite persistent on getting those into our PD days. So they are learning how to properly write it. And I see a lot of implementation happening.
I agree. You have been a huge influence upon all of our folks. One thing that I connected to with what you said was when somebody asks students what they learned in class that day, how students just kind of share the activity, right? You'll hear an answer, but based on what you described, if a classroom teacher or a parent or a principal says, hey, what did you learn in PE class today? Under your scenario, we hear things like, we played soccer today. They just state the activity. And I just wanted to highlight that one more time, because when you and I talk about how to align standards-based daily objectives to activities, it's going to be a drastic shift away from that.
Yes, they're going to demonstrate things, but we're really looking for that understanding, that knowing part of the learning.
Okay, so Jen, what then is the alternative to conducting PE lessons in the way that you just described? If we're trying to move away from just activities, just rules, what are we expecting teachers to do instead?
An alternative to simply just playing games and adding all the activities in, or just the rules to the games in PE, is to create standards-based daily learning objectives for each lesson. This can help guide those teachers to know where the students started, where they're supposed to be going, and how you can support them to get them there. So Gary, can you give me an example of a standard-based objective that the teachers you support use in their physical education classes?
You know, I had a feeling that you might ask, so I have one prepared here. So this CLO would be, and this is one I just want to note too, that this is a CLO that a teacher would write in their lesson plan. We're going to talk later about how to communicate in the student-friendly language. So I just don't want anybody to hear the CLO and be turned off and say, oh my gosh, my students aren't going to understand that. We're going to talk about what it sounds like to communicate to kids later. So this CLO would be, students will be able to physically demonstrate the overhand and underhand throw in a variety of activities and verbally compare and contrast the two skills using the words similar and different. And then you would put in any of your cues that you want students to use with the overhand and underhand throw. So some examples could just be side to target, arm back, step, follow through. And of course, you can change those to fit your teaching style.
Just to clarify, where did the language come from in that CLO? And what's this about comparing and contrasting?
So the language it comes from the first step in how to create. And we're going to get really methodical in just a moment on how to actually create these objectives. But that language about physically demonstrating the overhand and underhand throw in a variety of activities comes directly from a national standard. So that is 3rd through 5th grade, standard 1. The title develops a variety of motor skills, but in order for us to create daily objectives, we need to dig a little bit deeper than just the title. So we went into the grade span learning indicator, which is actually 1.5.10, and it says demonstrates throwing in a variety of practice tasks. So I took the language directly from that grade span learning indicator.
Yes, and shout out to these new national standards. I'm digging into them right now, and I love the direction they are going. But I do have a follow-up question for you.
Because I only answered half of your question. I think that might be why.
Yeah. So how do you choose which language function to use when building out that language part of the objective?
The language function, just so that we define some terms for everybody. In this CLO, the language function is compare and contrast. You can choose any language function you like. So we could just rattle off a couple. If I miss any, you chime in. So students can explain or describe. Sequencing is one that I see often for younger grades. Justification, analyzing, like giving feedback to each other.
A little shout out to Jessie Weber. She loved the DOK wheel, and I think us teacher leaders learned a lot of those language functions throughout the years, which made it a lot easier when we were writing our CLOs.
I loved working with Jessie, and yes, she was a huge advocate of making sure that students had language functions so that they could articulate their learning as well. to go back to your question about why did I choose compare and contrast in this particular objective, I think what we'll do is we'll just start talking about the process for creating them, because after you select the standard, it's the first step. So where that language function comes from, comparing and contrasting, is from something called an ideal student response. So I think it might be one of the most overlooked parts of lesson planning. It's very important, and a lot of folks maybe just don't quite know about it or how to utilize them. So what you want to do is, after you choose a standard and a grade span learning indicator, make believe that someone did exactly what you described earlier, which is ask one of your students, what did they learn in class today? And write down what you want your second grader or your fourth grader or your high schooler to respond to that question. So in this instance, I would imagine that maybe I taught the underhand throw on Monday and I taught the overhand throw on Tuesday, and I'm trying to think of what my Wednesday lesson is going to look like. And I imagine a situation where students are practicing both of those skills. Maybe there's various stations set up. And when I write my ideal student response to that question, it might sound something like, today in PE, I learned that something similar between the overhand throw and the underhand throw is that you always step with your opposite foot. I also learned that something different between those two throws is when I throw overhand, my elbow is up by my shoulder. And when I throw underhand, I release the ball down by my hip, or something to that effect. In that response, you notice that students are using the language similar and different, which tells you that you want to put compare and contrast into your objective. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that. And I always, anytime I planned any of my lessons, I always had 3 students in mind when I was planning throughout, not even just the CLO. And they're always in the back of my mind. So that connects with me in that planning part.
Do you think that there's only one language function that could be used in this particular scenario? Like, is there a right or a wrong answer, or do we have several options?
Oh, I think several options. And if you are thinking big picture with the unit and you're backwards planning, you know how you want to progress the students as well. So we're not going to start day one with something big. Like compare contrast might not be a first day necessarily. If you're just introducing that skill, you first would maybe want to have them identifying those cues before they're going to start comparing and contrasting those cues. So just developing that full unit and really thinking how that progresses throughout that time.
I like where you're going with this. So let's continue, because I mentioned that maybe on Monday you would teach students the overhand throw, and then on Tuesday you would teach them the underhand throw. If they only have one skill that they're learning for that day, you're obviously not going to be comparing and contrasting, right? So you might throw in a language function in one of those lessons where students are either sequencing the steps to the throw, or maybe they're describing what one of those throws looks like. We would determine that from, again, the ideal student response. So I'll give one more example. So if on your underhand throwing day, you start the lesson plan and you write down an ideal student response that says, today in PE, I learned that the first thing I do when I throw underhand is blank. Next, I do blank. And then finally, I do blank. By seeing the words first, next, and finally in your ideal student response, you know that you're going to connect that to the language of sequencing and put sequencing in your objective. So in that lesson, you would say students will be able to physically demonstrate the underhand throw and verbally sequence its cues.
Yes, you nailed that one.
Nailed it. Okay. So that gives us like what 3 lessons would look like, right? We would maybe be sequencing or describing, and then maybe on the third day, we would be comparing and contrasting those 2 skills. So I think what some teachers are going to be thinking is, you just shared with me an objective that has a content component, physical demonstration. It also has a language component in it. That's going to be confusing for my kids. What are some techniques that you 2 can share with me so that I could communicate that clearly in a way that my students understand it?
I think thinking about their development of language as well, and knowing what grade level you are teaching to. When you're designing that CLO, the grade level outcomes or the grade span learning indicator really helps guide us towards what our objective is going to be. So when it's big words in there, that's for us teachers to know what we need to plan to get them to there eventually. But we can break it down into, so if demonstrate throwing in a variety of practice tasks, we can just break it down into, okay, today you are going to be able to show me how to throw in the specific game that you're playing or the activity that you're doing. Is part of a hook too, that we're doing this, we're getting into this piece. And then once they're hooked into the doing part, then you can say, and you're going to be able to, I think mine was more like I got really excited when I brought the language in to get them to continue to listen and say, and then you're going to be able to tell me the sequence of the steps of rolling a ball so we can bowl. So different pieces of the language just to help either the hook, make it more understandable. And especially most of my students in the schools that I've taught at, we did have MLLs or ELLs, multi-language learners. And how can we break it down for all students to make it that they are going to be successful? And even adding visuals to that student-friendly language helps guide most of the students towards knowing what they're about to do and showing what they're about to do.
A lot of great things that you said in there. And I'm going to shout out another PE teacher, Coach Rossi over at Stedman. I think we're going to have a new rule also on this podcast. If someone gets a shout out, they have to be a guest. What do you think about that?
I like it.
So one of the things that Peter does really well is that he has like a sentence stem for himself for how he communicates his daily objectives. And the sentence stem is something like, today we have 2 jobs. And the 2 jobs are 1, the content or the physical demonstration, and 2, the language component. So it reminds him every day to communicate those 2 halves of the objective to his students.
Yes. Can I add on to something that reminded me about? So when I do my student facing rubric or learning roadmap, I have them separated into the content and the language piece. And I just start off small. Like we do start sometimes with just the content, getting them going, maybe send them out for a quick activity, then coming back and like, okay, you guys started really to show me these things. Now we're going to add another layer on. And so even getting them out and moving, they know what they are supposed to be doing in the physical piece, but then bringing them back like, okay, now that we're progressing. And again, I think just how I presented it, we're like, okay, like the next step is this. I can do that too. So just motivating them towards that objective.
I like that. And later we were going to talk about how someone who might want to start experimenting with adding content, language objectives into their lessons, that might be a great way for them to start to get used to it. You don't have to communicate everything all at once. Communicate your content, your physical objective, let students get moving, and then bring them back and give them an opportunity to articulate it through use of language. Other things I hear you saying are that we might not use a word like sequence with our students. What we might say to them is, today there's 2 things that are really important to me. One is that you're able to show me that you're getting better at the underhand throw, and I'm going to teach you how to do that. I'm going to share with you all the cues and demonstrate it for you. And the second thing that I'm going to be listening for is that you can put the cues to the underhand throw in order. And when we put things in order, we use language like first, second, next, and last. And then we're going to give students opportunities to do that throughout the lesson, but we're going to save that for a different conversation. There's 2 other things I want to talk about before we move on, because I think communicating objectives to students is super important. And it's a place where some teachers get hung up on. So I really want to make sure that we give lots of examples. So the next one is checking for students' understanding of the objective before moving on with the lesson. Do you have any experience with checking for students' understanding before just saying, okay, let's move on to the next activity in the lesson?
Yes. And that's, again, pre-planning. I think that's a big part of when you're lesson planning, just like thinking about the ideal student response. The ideal student response goes with what question you're asking for that checking for understanding as well. So you're like, okay, here's the objective. This is what I wish they would say. And then, okay, I presented the objective. Now I'm going to check to make sure that didn't just go right over all their heads and they're just ready to go play the activity. I'm making sure they understand, hey, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to get better at the underhand throw. So I'm really looking for that progress of your skill, and we're going to work towards this goal. And then having maybe the student say it in their own words, that really would connect with the rest of the class.
There's so many different directions we could take this conversation, and we have before, but this time we're recording it, so it's different. I want to go back to the check for understanding part for just a moment so I could share a couple of things that I've seen some really effective teachers do. So one thing, actually a classroom teacher that I saw do it several years ago, but I think it would work well in the gym also, is after communicating both the content and the language objective, have students talk with a partner for like 30 seconds and turn the content and language objective into a hashtag. Everybody's talking to a partner. You have 2 or 3 students share out when you're all done what their hashtag is. In this case, we would be looking for a hashtag that sounded something like hashtag compare and contrast throws, right? We want to make sure that all of the components are there, because if students say something like hashtag throw or hashtag clean up my backyard or whatever, we know that we haven't really communicated the components of that objective as clearly as we need to, because students aren't able to articulate it back to us. So that was one thing that I wanted to share. Anything you would want to add on to that?
I just need to know if they made the hashtag with their hands while they were saying it.
They certainly should be required to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think even with that quick turn and talk, another strategy is to have their partner say what they heard. So there's just another level of listening and, ooh, maybe I didn't quite get what we were supposed to be doing, but now that I heard my partner say it and now I'm going to share it, it's just another layer.
It almost sounds like you want to come back and do another episode on accountable talk structures in physical education. Is that what I'm hearing?
I know I can't stay on one strand.
Well, this is interesting because as you know, the first several episodes of this podcast that I did were all on learning environment strategies. And this is the first one that is now moving over to highly impactful instructional methods. And there really is no untangling them, right? Once you start to do something like create and communicate an effective CLO, you open the door to doing all these other things, providing students with opportunities to use that language, checking for their understanding of all of these things. You need to have some accountable talk structures in your back pocket ready to go so that these things happen with efficiency. The other thing you thought I was going to forget, but the other thing that I wanted to talk about was a really effective method that I've seen for communicating objectives, especially to younger students, is to turn your objective into a story. I wonder if there's a story that you and I could collaboratively create that we would tell to a 3rd grader or a 4th grader or a 5th grader that would communicate this objective in student-friendly language. You have any ideas?
Yeah. I can maybe I'll start with a scenario. So we are with some friends. We are at a park and we see some others on the baseball diamond throwing and catching a ball, and we want to join in.
I like this scenario. So we're gonna start by telling students, hey, imagine you're at a park, you're watching kids play baseball. One thing you notice though is that sometimes they throw the ball overhand, like if they need to throw it from shortstop to first base. You also see them throwing underhand sometimes, like if they're close to each other, if the second baseman fields a ball and just wants to flip it underhand to the first baseman. So you notice that there's 2 different skills. And I think if I were the teacher and I was sharing the scenario, I would close out the story by saying something like, as I was watching these baseball players, I thought about teaching the overhand and underhand throw to my 3rd graders at school. And I think that something that could really help you remember all of the cues for the underhand and the overhand throw is if I asked you throughout the lesson to compare and contrast them. And I think that would be a great way to communicate that objective to students so that they know they're going to be saying, this is what's similar between them and this is what's different.
I think you did a great job on that, and bravo. I just wrote a lesson on this one. So that was actually very, very true when I was thinking about that lesson.
Well, you started it off and I just came in and finished it. So I appreciate that. Before maybe we give another example, I think it would be worth just for a moment talking about, because you mentioned it earlier and I don't want to leave it hanging out there, how you create questions. So we're not really going to get into assessment today. That's a conversation for a whole nother time. But you said earlier that teachers should use the ideal student response in order to create questions that they're going to ask students at various points throughout the lesson. I'm always a big ask a question at the beginning, ask a question at the middle, and ask a question at the end type of person. Knowing that our ideal student response says something like, these are the similarities and these are the differences, what are some questions that you might expect a teacher during this lesson to ask their students?
First, they need to go right to the language that they put in to their objective. That's going to guide them. So if it is compare and contrast, their question needs to have comparing and contrasting. So you're having those questions guide them. So at the end, they are able to explain. So it might not just come off the bat in the middle of the activity. Like you said, I do the same thing. I chunk it out. So they're building even that rigor up to that end question, but you're guiding them to be able to be successful and answer that by having questions that get them to that language function.
So if we're doing backwards planning and we're using that ideal student response as our end result, we want to make sure that we're asking questions like, what is something that is the same between the overhand and underhand throw? We're not going to get into today whether we're asking that as a turn and talk, whether we're asking that individually, doesn't quite matter just for the sake of our conversation today. We also want to make sure that we're asking what are some things that are different between the overhand and underhand throw, because we know that if we ask those two questions in particular, students are going to use language that matches the ideal student response that we created when we were lesson planning. What happens if we set up like the most perfect turn and talk you could ever imagine, and a teacher asks a closing question of the two throws, which throw is your favorite, overhand or underhand? What type of information does that give us?
Not much. And it's not leading them to that objective. It gives them a short answer or a one-word answer that's not building up to a student discussion or a student discourse. So it's just leaving it very close-ended, and then the learning kind of stops if they just have to say one word.
So whether it's a question like that, or what was your favorite activity today, or what do you hope we'll do next time? Sometimes these questions are fine if you just want to ask students in passing, right? I just want to draw the difference between a question like that and a question that gives you evidence that students are making progress towards the objective. So if we want that type of evidence, if we want to be able to collect data at some point, not only do we want to see students out there performing the underhand and overhand throw and getting better at it, we also want evidence that they're saying things in this particular lesson. Of course, it's going to be different in every lesson, but in this lesson, they're saying things like, this is what's similar and this is what's different.
I think that just helps them when somebody asks you, what did you learn? They practice saying it too. They didn't just get the CLO launched at the beginning and then it never comes back again throughout the class. So these pieces in there with that checking for understanding, those times for student discussion, that they practice it. They got to talk. They got to show their learning in a different way. And then when somebody says, what did you learn today? They can say how I was able to tell you the difference between an underhand throw and an overhand throw. And that's what we're really looking for.
You brought up such a good point with making sure that the objective and all of its components are embedded throughout the lesson. So we don't just want teachers to say, today we're learning how to compare and contrast the overhand throw, and then kids get into their activity and they never refer back to it. So we got to keep that objective alive throughout the lesson. One analogy that I use is I was watching a teacher do a manipulatives lesson with balloons, and I saw the kids tapping balloons with all various body parts, fingers, elbows, knees, etc. And I thought to myself, oh, that's just like communicating an objective. You communicate your objective early in the lesson and you tap the balloon up into the air, and then the balloon starts to fall back down to the gym floor. And 5 minutes later, 8 minutes later, whatever, you need to come up with another way to remind students that that's what they're learning for the day. That doesn't mean you need to stop the lesson and say, don't forget everybody, today what we're doing is blank. If that's your style, you certainly could. But there's lots of other ways to communicate an objective throughout the lesson. So like you mentioned, making sure that the questioning is aligned back to the objective. If I pause everybody and say, talk to a partner about what's similar and different between the overhand throw and the underhand throw, you have 45 seconds. That is me communicating my objective. If the activities are connected back to the objective, that's another way to do it. So there's lots of different ways to communicate your objective throughout the lesson. I'm glad you brought that up.
And I'm glad you brought up connect the activities to the objective. So sometimes we think that's just an automatic, but it's not. Like, hey, I just saw this activity on social media. I'm doing it tomorrow, but does it connect? Like if it does, great. Did you have your objective written and you're just swapping a different activity out? But yeah, that should be connected throughout as well. And I have one more touch point on the language piece that gets muddy sometimes. Vocabulary and language is different. So if, let's say I go into a classroom and this has happened because I'm there and I feel like sometimes they're like, oh, I want to show that I'm doing this language objective that we've been working on through PD. And they ask the students to repeat a vocab word. Like, hey, squats, everybody say squats. And then they do. And they're like, okay, we got the language down. So you want to use the vocabulary to add to that language piece. So if they are whatever the language function is, they can use that vocab like you had mentioned at the beginning of, okay, I want to hear you say words like overhand throw, underhand throw. So we're using those words to help the language function. We're just not repeating the vocab word. It is part of answering the questions or connecting to the activity.
That's so important that you brought that up. So I truly want to thank you for really drawing out the difference between content vocabulary and language function and form, because the content vocabulary comes very easy to us. This is our content. This is the thing that we're experts in. It's the language function and form which ties all that vocabulary together. In the multi-language education department in DPS, they call the language form that students use the mortar and the content vocabulary the bricks. Because like you said in your example, if students are just using bricks, all they're doing is shouting out content words, squats, push-ups, bench press, right? If they're turning them into full sentences and they're using those mortar words, they're saying things like, when I do a squat, it looks like blank, if they're supposed to be describing that day. Or one thing that you did really well on your bench press is blank. Next time, I want you to try this as a next step if they happen to be analyzing that day. So they're taking the language function and form and they're creating complete sentences with the content vocabulary. That was great that you brought that up. Super important. Let's recap the process real quick because you reminded me of teachers who find these great activities online, kind of like how we started our conversation. And we're saying, don't just take that great activity that you saw and just run it wholesale in the gym, right? We want you to do something with that fun activity. So I'm going to recap the process. The first thing that you want to do is choose a standard and a grade level expectation, not just the title of the standard, but break down that standard into either the grade level expectation or the grade span learning indicator from the national standard. Then you're going to use that language to create an ideal student response. You're going to analyze the ideal student response and look for language form. And you're going to use that language form to connect it to a function, which you're going to put in your objective. So if you see similar and different in your ideal student response, put compare and contrast in your CLO. If you see that you want students to say that something looks like something or sounds like something or feels like something, they're describing. So put describe in your CLO. After that, you're going to figure out how you want to communicate your objective to students in a student-friendly way. Are you going to tell them a story? Are you going to break down the language component? Are you going to check for their understanding after you communicate it? And then finally, the part that we touched on a little bit was, what questions are you going to ask students that are going to allow them to articulate their progress toward the objective? Because if you don't plan out your questions, you get caught up in the moment and you ask students about what their favorite thing was or. So that would be the process. And then I'm going to see if we can put ourselves on the spot and create one that we didn't create earlier, because that one was too easy because I already had it created. So let's see what we can do. I pulled a standard from Colorado because I really like the sixth grade level expectation. It says, exhibits responsible social behavior by cooperating with classmates, demonstrating inclusive behaviors. You and I love social skills standards. So that's why I figured we would take one of these and try to create a CLO based on a social skill.
Okay.
All right. So the first thing we're going to do is, well, we already chose the standard. We're going to create an ideal student response. So Jen, if you were teaching sixth grade, what would you want your sixth graders to say that they learned in PE class today if this was the standard?
I would hope that they would say, I learned how to invite students in to be a part of my group. I was able to be a part of a group. And I would want them to say that when I communicate to others, I use appropriate responses.
Okay. So in that response, I think what we have students doing is, I think they're explaining why they're doing these things, which to me almost kind of lends itself a little towards justification. I wonder, and when we write these ideal student responses, they don't always come out perfect the first time, right? So we're going to look at them, we're going to analyze them, we might rewrite them. I'm wondering if, along with students being able to exhibit these physically, content objective already stashed aside, right? We already know that we want students to demonstrate appropriate or responsible social behaviors physically. I wonder if we can have students describe what responsible behavior looks like in physical activity. And we could even increase the rigor a little bit by providing students with an opportunity to justify why exhibiting inclusive behaviors is important. What are your thoughts on that?
I like that because I think it will show how these social behaviors impact their class.
Okay. So I like that we're doing this in real time so that teachers can really hear how you plan out an ideal student response and where all these different things come from. So based on our conversation, I think my ideal student response might evolve to be something like, an inclusive behavior in physical activity looks like inviting my peers to join in a game. It's important to display inclusive behaviors because we don't ever want anyone to feel left out of any physical activity or any type of group. Anything you would want to add to that ideal student response?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay. So if we know that, now this one's a little unique too, because students are kind of doing two language components, right? They're describing and justifying. So what might the CLO sound like with both a physical, a content component, and a language component if we have students both describing and justifying?
The physical content would be whatever your beginning is, but students will demonstrate responsible social behaviors during said activity and justify why inclusive behaviors, whatever your perfect one was.
That was really good because I think you nailed it. So you want the objective to be, some folks write, students will be able to, others write, I will be able to, like if they're writing it from the perspective of the students. So it could be, I will be able to physically demonstrate inclusive behaviors in blank, whatever the activity for the day is. Another reason that you and I love these social skills behaviors is because you can pick any of your students' favorite activities and still teach them a really important standards-based social skill. I will be able to physically demonstrate inclusive behaviors in blank and justify the impact that inclusive behaviors have on a group.
Yeah.
The language that students would use would be, language form for justify is because, right? Whenever you ask somebody to justify something, they're going to use the word because in response. And then the content vocabulary could be inclusive behaviors, impact, inviting, right? Inviting our peers to join an activity might be something that we want them to say as well. And I like to leave the door open a little bit for the content vocabulary sometimes, because you don't always know exactly what responses you're going to get from students, right?
I love having students build the words too. Like, what does this mean? Sometimes with this, you do have to break down what it means. And then that's when they're starting to come up with the vocab that will lead into them using, especially at the 6th grade level, they're able to do that.
Okay, it's your favorite part, Jen. We're going to communicate this objective to students by telling a story. You want to go, or do you want me to? Jen is off camera now. I could try to make something up, but I
am not a storyteller.
You're not the storyteller.
I will help. I will help with the story.
Okay. So this objective is about inclusive behaviors, right? So I might say something like, I had a family party last weekend, and some of my nephews came over, and they were playing bocce ball, and 3 of them were playing, and they left one of my nephews just kind of sitting over on the side, and I started to feel really bad for him. So I brought the kids together and I asked them, hey, what could you do? How could you maybe change the rules to this game? Or how could you invite someone into a game to make them feel comfortable, like they're a part of the activity? And it was great because I didn't even have to give them any ideas. They started sharing ideas with me. Now, I'm not going to tell you what ideas they shared with me because I want to see what ideas you come up with today in class. So in class today, I have a couple of great games that you're going to get a chance to play. I want you to demonstrate inclusive behaviors. So make sure that everybody feels like they're a part of the game and they're included and involved. And there are going to be points during today's lesson where I pause you and ask you to describe what an inclusive behavior might look or sound like. And I'm going to also ask you to tell me why inclusive behaviors are important and what impact they have on physical activity. Jen, what do you think?
If I go back into the classroom, I'm going to add storytelling to my strategies.
Sold.
Such a great job.
Okay, I sold you on that one. Perfect.
Yeah.
All right, so the last thing that we can do is just script a couple of questions. All right, so knowing that we want students to describe, what might be a question or a prompt that we want to ask students at some point in the lesson?
I think asking them how they would feel if they were the one not included into an activity.
That's good. Yep, I like that. So we could say, you know what, that would be a really great prompt or a question to give students at the beginning of the lesson, because we're going to bring in some prior experience that they may have had, and they can make a connection between that experience and today's standards-based learning of the day. So if we said something like, describe a time where you felt either included in an activity and describe what that felt like, or describe a time where you felt like you weren't included in an activity and what that felt like. And we can have them talk with a partner about that and then share out some ideas. That's a brilliant question to open up this lesson. All right. So what might you ask kids a little bit later in the lesson?
I think we can ask them a question of how they did include somebody into an activity.
I like that. So we could ask them how they included someone. So basically we're still on describe, right? So we could prompt them with, describe one way that you included someone in the first activity that we played today. Let's make believe this is like a middle of the class question, right? And then knowing that our language objective is justify, let's fast forward all the way to the end of the lesson, and let's give students an opportunity to answer why it's important to display inclusive behaviors, not just in physical activities, but outside of PE as well. And when you come back and do an episode on standards-based social skills, we'll talk about all the connections that teachers can make between social skills in PE and our standard and outside real world contexts. What do you think about those 3 questions that we just created on the fly?
I think great. And I would just go back and revise maybe the middle one for more of an impact, because we did talk about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Good point. Okay. So I like that. So let's revise it real quick. Describe one inclusive behavior that you demonstrated today and the impact that it had on the activity.
Yes.
I love that. I really do think that that was impactful for us to kind of demonstrate for folks how you walk through that process and how it's not anywhere near perfect the first time you go through it. It also helps if you have a thought partner like I had. So thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we're going to finish with just a couple of questions that I think some folks might be wondering. So first thing is, why should I be doing all of these things? What is the impact that these standards-based content and language objectives is going to have on student learning? We already touched on it a little bit, but let's really drive the point home. Why standards-based content and language objectives?
The standards were made for guidance, especially in PE. Our outcomes really drive that objective to start. And then we just have to use our creativity to continue to go with that language. The impact that it has on students is it's fairness. It's not fair that a student just comes in and leaves without that learning. They should know, hey, this is where you're heading. This is how I'm going to get you there. And at the end, where did we land? Where are we towards that goal? Because it is a progress. So I don't think it's fair that a student does not get that opportunity to demonstrate their learning that the objective gives, or get that other opportunity to articulate what they are learning.
When we think about equity in PE, I think this is one method that falls directly into that category. So we're providing students with opportunities not just to demonstrate their learning physically, we're also providing students with opportunities to articulate their learning as well. So that if a student isn't making as much progress in a physical skill as we would hope, maybe they're not meeting that grade level expectation, but they're still able to insert your favorite language objective, whether it's analyze the performance of it or compare it to a different skill or justify why it's important. If they're able to articulate that learning, they might still be able to show progress towards that grade level outcome.
Yeah, I always think about some of the best coaches out there were not the best players. So they took that track of learning and really dug into the sport or skill they're coaching to make even better players underneath them.
That's a brilliant example. So that's the impact that it has on students. It gives students the opportunity to articulate their standards-based knowledge along with physically demonstrate it. What impact does something like this have on a PE program as a whole? So if we think back to what you described earlier, where maybe we're just sharing rules, we're just playing a game, we're going over something like all the different fouls that can happen in basketball and memorizing them, versus an experience where students are physically demonstrating a standards-based skill and they're using language to articulate it. How do people view a PE program that has those components in it?
It's advocacy for your role too. You are also a teacher. You are teaching to the standards just like any general classroom teacher. So if you want to advocate for your program, that's a great place to start if that's not happening. So when someone walks in and hears the learning happening while they are demonstrating the learning, it really does help advocate that you are doing something within that class. Also, it's not recess. We are able to go out to recess and have an unstructured play time. But when we're in our instructional time, we are showing that we are building upon these standards and showing growth through those. So I just think the biggest part is advocating that we are not just a planned period, we are an actual learning class.
I like your comparison to recess. I've thought about that, of course, but I never really thought about creating an ideal student response for what a student learned at recess. And I think by doing that and comparing the two, it should really be crystal clear to PE teachers on what the difference is, right? Because at recess, an appropriate response would be, I played on the slide and I had a good time with my friends, right?
Yep.
Whereas in PE, it needs to be, I got better at underhand throwing today, and these are the steps, and this is the order that they go in, or whatever.
Yeah.
It legitimizes a PE program, and it makes it distinct from any other recess type activities that might be going on at school. All right, last question. So we have some listeners who are interested in starting to make this shift, but they're a little nervous about it. So how might they ease their way in to incorporating standards-based content and language objectives in their PE program?
I think just being comfortable with experimenting and working through it. It took me year after year to really get what I wanted down on how I was going to launch my CLO and all the things that go in it. So it never was perfect. And each day I would come back and try something different. And I would change schools and be like, these students aren't taking it how I used to. And you just sometimes have to be okay with making that shift and changing things up and being transparent with students, being open and honest with them. They're going to buy in a lot more on, hey, we're going to try something new. When you're saying, this is how I'm going to let you know what we're learning today, just however you're doing it, just be honest and they're going to grow with you. And just communicate standards-based content. It's in the standards to guide us to that. And we just move past just playing activities, past the rules, and we really start focusing on the language expectations when you're comfortable. So start with the content piece. Like, okay, I know how to say we are going to be able to demonstrate skipping today. If that's where we are, and then you slowly, one time during that unit, try to add in and be able to compare and contrast between a skip and a gallop. So something just as simple as that, and knowing when you're thinking about the ideal responses, you're able to achieve that. And then you add it in more and more, and the students start getting more comfortable along with you. They're starting to learn how to communicate with each other.
That is some great advice. I bet you just made a lot of folks feel quite a bit more comfortable with some of the content that we covered today. The only thing that I'll add to that is just making sure that folks dig into the standard itself. I know that a mistake that I made, especially in my first 2 years at least, was I would write my lesson plans and then just slap the title of a standard at the top of it. So if we were if we were doing ultimate frisbee or badminton, one of my favorite things to teach, I would be like, oh yeah, badminton, standard 1, throw that at the top. But I didn't use the standard as a resource. Get away from just the title of it and go into those grade span learning indicators and utilize that language to plan your lesson and teach that standards-based content to your students. Jen, we did, I think, a great job today of really laying out the case for why standards-based content and language objectives are beneficial for teachers and students and PE programs.
I really think that people will get it. I think that breakdown of which pieces go in sequenced order will really, that's your objective, listeners, is sequence the order of creating that CLO.
If we were really thinking ahead, we would have had an objective for our conversation. We would have written a CLO for our podcast episode today. Well, maybe next time. Jen, thank you so much. That was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.